name is Reed, and I would like to welcome you to the Voyageurs Rendezvous 2017 online paddling school. This is a 6-part video series that will teach you about the importance of the canoe to Canada's history and give you some tips on how to get into the sport yourself. We are very lucky to have Jim and Doreen Guilloux join us for this series. They have been paddling for 48 years, exploring Canada's extensive waterways, and are experts on the subject of canoes. They will take us through our first session, explaining the canoe's importance during the fur trade. Take it away, Doreen.
Thank you very much for this exciting experience to become part of this video series about the fur trade and the canoes and their part in Canada's history. It's a very important part of our world, and we're excited to be here. The furs that are displayed here were a part of the history of Canada as well. They represent the furs that were collected in fur trade days, and Jim will talk about that now.
So fashionable people in Europe, like ourselves, demanded furs mainly for decoration, for clothing, and the big pull was for hats. The men wanted beaver hats. Hats made of felt like this, hats like this. There were other furs that were very, very valuable as well, like mink. The most wonderful coat could be made. It was warm. And in those days, the modern textile industry wasn't born, so keeping warm was a huge problem. People could wear furs, but they couldn't wear polyester. Very, very valuable. This one is the smallest and one of the most valuable. Ermine, worn only by royalty. Nobody else could even touch it. Known to those of us who keep chickens as weasels. We try to keep them away. Also, the ladies would really love to wear furs just to look cute. Drape them around their shoulders. These furs with the hide and the fur were highly desirable commodities. But the thing that drove the trade right across Canada was the Humboldt beaver, our national emblem. The fur trade took these beaver pelts back to Europe, where a huge industry was born to shave off the outer hairs, take out the inner hair and pound them into felt, and then you had a very unusual kind of material that I said as before you could make these kind of hats with. Some modern hats are still made with beaver fur.
Canada's fur trade industry flourished for almost 200 years. To make a very interesting story very short, in 1535, Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence River, and he met a flotilla of over 100 canoes paddled by First Nations people who were meeting the people from Europe, hoping to be able to trade their furs for kettles and beads and knives and hatchets and that sort of thing. It was an exciting time, and the fur trade was just starting to boom. In the 1600s, fur traders from Montreal and Quebec, called coureurs de bois, began travel by canoe out into the West Country so that they could meet the First Nations people. They thought that if they could actually go out and trade where the people lived, they would have a better chance of getting more furs and more furs quickly. The fur trade industry developed a route to go across Canada that they found worked best for them. It was an arduous route. It started at Montreal, went up, and I set up the Ottawa and Mattawa rivers, and these were fast rivers and places that are very narrow. So it was quite difficult with those big canoes that they used. And then it went through Lake Nipissing and down into Georgian Bay. These three Great Lakes here, Superior, Michigan, and Huron, are very big lakes. And so they wanted to stay as close to the shoreline as possible and yet use the most efficient route. So they stayed at the top of Georgian Bay and went through this channel here to where Sault Ste. Marie is today. And then today at Sault Ste. Marie there's locks. But in the early days there was just a nasty set of rapids that they had to portage around and fight their way up. Then they got into Lake Superior. It's, as you know, a huge, huge lake with big, big waves on it. And it was very dangerous. They could easily have a load of furs tip over or lose some of their cargo along the way. So they stayed as close to the shoreline as they could as they came around to Grand Portage. Now, Grand Portage was a portage over a height of land that went into the Rainy Lake River series here. There's a little I'll just move this and maybe you can see it, maybe not, but there's a little series of lakes and rivers through here along the border. Very difficult in places, rocky and so on, hard to get the canoes through. Then they went up through Lake of the Woods and then into Lake Winnipeg. By this time they had smaller canoes. Jim will explain more about that later. For here they had the great big canoes. Here on this smaller route they had to have the smaller canoes. Then they went up Lake Winnipeg, or sometimes up through Lake Manitoba and Lake Winnipegosis, depending on weather and other conditions. Then they went through Cedar Lake, and then they got on the North Saskatchewan River system, and this was kind of like a highway that went all the way through Prince Albert, Fort Edmonton, and all the way across to where we are right here at Rocky Mountain House. There was a lot of things that came into play there with sandbars and big winds and time and temperature and mosquitoes, but they were canoeing, and I gotta say, with all my years of experience canoeing, that weather really doesn't matter, it's just great, so I'm sure they had some good times too.
Rolling.
So the two main trading companies that evolved were the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company. They were bitter rivals, and there's a long story about their development and their demise. During the height of the fur trade, crews of voyageurs, paddlers and traders from Montreal and crews from Northwest met at the trading post Fort Charlotte at Grand Portage at the western end of Lake Superior. Trading goods were transferred from the large 40-foot canoes to the smaller 25-foot canoes. The large 40-foot canoes actually weighed 600 pounds, 270 kilograms. Monster big canoes. You don't see them today. I have never seen one. And the smaller canoes were 25 foot long and they weighed 140 kilograms, 300 pounds. These could be carried by 4 men, much more useful in the tighter, smaller waters and in the rough waters. These were paddled by 5 to 8 men, and the trips were always a race against weather and time. Start out in the winter, come home in the winter. Weather was a real problem at the beginning and the end of each trip. When you start out from a place as far west as Rocky Mountain House, you start out braving snowstorms and braving ice. When you come back, you're doing about the same thing. It was a long, long trip down to Lake Superior and back. 2 different classes of voyageurs developed as well. The boys from the west were very, very proud of their ability to travel almost so many miles across Canada, and looked down on the boys from the east who merely traveled just a little bit of eastern Canada. The paddlers from the east were known as pork eaters because they ate salt pork. You could easily, for the short time they had to paddle, carry salted meat, which wouldn't rot, and dried peas, and you could get back home and still be fit and alive. But paddling those vast distances across the west required a different kind of food, and the voyageurs discovered from the native people pemmican, dried meat, dried buffalo meat, dried any meat, but mostly buffalo meat. And if you had dried meat, you could have a little bit in a small package that could last a long, long time. They could carry their own food and keep on going. They paddled usually from dawn till dusk with regular breaks to smoke a pipe, sometimes covering 80 miles a day, although 50 miles was the average. These were tough men, became a legend throughout the entire nation, and in their own time they became a legend.
Voyageurs were folk heroes and celebrated in folklore and music. And without these hard-working men and the canoes they paddled, the history of the fur trade would be written differently. The voyageurs were real characters, and they loved singing and having fun as they paddled. Jim is going to tell us more about the music that they sang along the way.
The voyageurs sang old folk songs. The modern music industry had not been invented. They sang children's songs. They sang songs that had been passed down from mouth to mouth for 400 years, and they sound rather odd today, but they're beautiful music to paddle to, and a part of Canadian history. Songs like En roulant ma boule roulant, en roulant ma boule, derrière chez nous il y a des, whatever you want, coups, enfants, and you make up the verses. And the voyageurs who could sing and lead the others were paid more because they were so important. It raised the spirits of everybody. You could paddle for a long stretch. Doreen and I still sing when we paddle today. We think paddling to music is a wonderful thing. They sang songs that children in schools still learn today. Frère Jacques, dormez-vous, dormez-vous, sonne les matines. Can you imagine paddling when you're singing these songs? To us, it's an inherent part of the whole thing. And
could I interject here and just say, ask you to tell him the song that you taught our grandson to sing along when he was paddling. You just had him go paddling, paddling, paddling.
With my grandson,
paddling.
I invented a song. Rowan, I said, when we paddle, we sing our paddling song. Oh, I said, it's very difficult to learn the words, but you should remember them after a few tries. It goes like this. Paddling, 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 paddling. It gets even more intricate as you go along. Paddling, 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 paddling. The second verse is even more difficult. Paddling, paddling. And we had so much fun with this simple two-word little two-note song, paddling all across. We were actually paddling across the Churchill River, the fur trade route of the early fur traders in northern Saskatchewan. What a good time. So singing made the journeys very much more enjoyable. They also all smoked. They stopped for a smoke regularly, and this often marked where they had stopped and started on their journeys. And they would ask each other, have we traveled 2 pipes or 3? They were renowned for their carrying of heavy weights. These guys, some of them were equal to modern weightlifters. Can you imagine carrying 700 pounds? You can still see people do this if you go to the trappers festivals in Western Canada, where the king trapper ends up carrying more than 700 pounds in order to win a trappers festival. They boasted of their speed and their courage and their ability to do all of the things they did well, and to do them quickly, and to do them on a very upper crustacean level. One method they adopted to carry their load was to carry it for about a mile, set it down, go back and get something else. This provided them with a rest while they're going back. Canoeists all still use this method today. Doreen and I always do this, especially if you're carrying a heavy load. Then your knees start to hurt a little bit. Excuse me. You just put it down, go back to where the big load is, pick up another piece. If it's smaller, you carry it past the first one or to it, and just keep carrying things back and forth until you're over the portage. Depending again on the length of the portage. A portage can be only the length of the canoe. Some of them are that close. You paddle up to the shore, hike your stuff the length of the canoe, hop your canoe across, fill it, paddle on. A quote by an early voyageur is recorded by James H. Baker in a collection of work called Lake Superior, went like this. Said one of these men, long past 70 years of age, in other words, my age, I could carry, paddle, and walk and sing with any man I ever saw. I have been 24 years a canoe man and 41 years in service. No portage was ever too long for me. 50 songs could I sing. I have saved the lives of 10 voyageurs, have had 12 wives and 6 running dogs. I spent all my money in pleasure. Were I a young man again, I would do it all over again. There is no life so happy as a voyageur's life.
Rocky Mountain House was one of the most westerly trading posts and became an important trading center for First Nations and traders who were trading as far west as the Pacific. Between 1799 and 1876, it was a base from which David Thompson made his explorations looking for a passage to the Pacific. The fur trade industry was an important link that opened Canadian exploration and settlement. The canoes and voyageurs made it possible. As the fur trade moved west, so did the people, and more settlements sprang up along the canoe route. Because the fur trade, or the furs collected at Rocky Mountain House and other western posts were paddled to Montreal by voyageurs, modern day voyageurs honored this important part of history with a centennial canoe race and pageant. In 1967, they paddled 3,283 miles or 5,283 kilometers from Rocky Mountain House to Montreal on the old fur trade route. But more about that in the second video entitled The 1967 Centennial Canoe Quest, and I hope you'll be able to listen to that one as well. Thank you.